Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Delani Bartlette, and she's going to be talking about her book, The Dumond Affair, which seems really interesting, and it occurs a good deal back in time. Maybe you can give us kind of the 2-minute overview of what happened, and then I'll kind of dive into my questions from there.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. So the Dumond Affair actually refers to the part that had to do with Mike Huckabee's presidential ambitions. It was a fellow named Wayne Dumond who raped a 17-year-old cheerleader in the mid 1980s who just happened to be a distant relative of Bill Clinton's. And this Wayne Dumond, he was arrested, he went to trial, he was convicted by a jury, he was sentenced, but his wife really did a lot of lobbying with the evangelicals, which is a really big, powerful organization in a lot of states, including Arkansas. And so she was able to get a lot of people on that bandwagon believing that Wayne Dumond was innocent because somehow Bill Clinton had framed him and had him castrated. And so when Mike Huckabee, thanks to the dragnet of the Whitewater investigation, Mike Huckabee was elevated from lieutenant governor to governor of the state of Arkansas. And one of the first things he did was to push to get Wayne Dumond freed against the protests of his victims, plural, as well as other women and people. And sadly, Wayne Dumond went on to rape and murder 2 women in Missouri after he was released.
So that's kind of the backdrop. And thank you for the succinct and pretty clear rendition of that. I mean, it's interesting because we get into all these conspiracy theories that have really been germinating in the last 10 years. And maybe that's the connection and why you decided to write on this, because in some ways it seems like kind of a foretelling of future events in the U.S. But what were your thoughts when you decided to write on this case?
Well, I had been interested by the Wayne Dumond affair from the beginning because it's just a fascinating case for a lot of reasons. But the point that I really decided that I needed to publish this and get this out in the world was in the immediate aftermath of the Pizzagate incident, because the conspiracy theory that Edgar Madison Welch believed that had been being spread by all these right-wing operatives was that there was this sex trafficking operation taking place in the basement of Comet Ping Pong, and at the center of this were many Democrats, including and especially Hillary Clinton. And there were all kinds of accusations of child sexual abuse, child torture, satanic ritual abuse, just, everything you can think of. And I remember the national media, the larger media that was covering it, were just shocked and, oh my God, how could someone believe this absolute craziness? Like, this is just off the charts. And having lived in Arkansas during all the decades of the, ballooning conspiracy theories against the Clintons, I was frankly shocked that other people didn't know how many people believed some of these conspiracy theories. And so my flabbergastedness at the naivete, I guess, of the national media was what made me wanted to get this story out to a wider audience.
Yes, and so people who may not be as familiar, Pizzagate is kind of the key seminal incident or quote unquote incident that led to the formation, or I don't know if formation's the right word, but it's the center of the QAnon phenomenon.
Yeah, it was like the beta test.
Right.
It was like the trial balloon that turned into QAnon.
Very interesting. So yes, so there is a linkage here. And so let's get back into the case. So why did Huckabee kind of center on this particular case?
Well, so Wayne Dumond's wife, a woman named Dusty Dumond, real churchy lady. Wayne liked to marry real churchy women because, it gives that cover of, oh, I'm a good church going man. I couldn't possibly be a criminal, right? So Dusty, after Wayne was, convicted and sentenced, Dusty was an absolute force, just, advocating and pushing this lie that her husband was innocent. And she came up here to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and stayed with this crazy televangelist, or I shouldn't say televangelist. He was more of a AM talk radio evangelist named J. Cole. And they began spreading the conspiracy theory that Bill Clinton was responsible for putting this poor innocent man, Wayne Dumond, behind bars. And so J. Cole was part of the State Baptist Convention, which was the largest organization in the state at the time, the most powerful, and still is one of the most powerful organizations in the state. And J. Cole had helped Mike Huckabee first set up his first media operations, and then helped Mike Huckabee get named as the youngest director of the Arkansas Baptist Convention, State Baptist Convention. And that was the springboard that enabled Huckabee to then get elected just barely to lieutenant governor. So when J. Cole is basically saying you need to, repay me by freeing this poor innocent man, Wayne Dumond, that's how I see it.
It's interesting. So this is all taking place kind of as Arkansas is going from the state that was kind of Democratic to becoming a very conservative bastion now. And those who are younger, I was in college in the 90s, so I remember the Clinton years very clearly. But for those who are younger, like, there were conspiracies abound in the Clinton administration. Everything from the death of Vince Foster to Whitewater, which was somewhat real, but got into these very conspiratorial aspects. So this was not really that out of the ordinary type of thing during the Clinton era and kind of the post-Clinton governorship.
Right. Yeah, Clinton was actually a very popular governor. He was only the second longest serving governor behind Orville Faubus, and that was only by a few months. But there was a faction, evangelicals and fundamentalists really hated him because his wife was a feminist. She hadn't changed her last name. She made public appearances not wearing any makeup. Oh, the horrors, and she had her own law career. Bill Clinton was, well loved by the Black community because he supported civil rights. They were pro-LGBTQ rights. And so the evangelical fundamentalists of this state just absolutely hated him. They painted him as just this complete moral degenerate, him and Hillary both. They were accused of every possible thing you can imagine, from drugs to sex to murder to you name it. So it was, among a lot of the evangelicals and like the AM talk radio stations and the religious shows, on the little local TV station, that these conspiracy theories continually were just circulating and kind of growing because, Us hillbillies, we love us a good story. We don't let the facts get in the way. So every retelling, it gets a little bit crazier, a little bit bigger, a little bit stranger. And so it was, as you said, after the death of Vince Foster, that the Arkansas Project was born, funded by right-wing operative Richard Mellon Scaife. And the Arkansas Project, the whole project was to come down here to Arkansas and cultivate quote unquote sources who could find dirt on the Clintons. And, they weren't fact checking. Anybody who had any kind of allegation against the Clintons, they would immediately be, paid and brought on, and, their allegations spread. And it was easy pickings. I mean, there was plenty of conspiracy theories to go around. So
And so you're kind of tempted to say, well, all is fun and games until somebody loses an eye. But now we have a problem, right? Because somebody actually did, not literally, but figuratively. And so there's a victim in this case, Ashley Stevens, who was not only attacked by Dumond physically, but was later vilified by kind of all these crazy anti-Clinton conspiracy theorists.
yeah, exactly. And now she had been a minor when it happened. She was only 17. And so it used to be, and among many media outlets still is, policy not to name or identify minor victims of crimes. So they weren't calling her out by name, but they would call her things like the supposed victim. They would say that rape never happened. It was a lot of the typical allegations that any woman gets when she comes forward with allegations of rape. But because there was this political angle to it, it went wider and further, and there was much more vitriol behind it.
And that's a good way to put it, because this is a problem in general. It's why rape reporting is so low. We've had, generations of problems. It's better now, but it's still not good.
Yeah, it's one of the easiest crimes to get away with. It's the least likely to get an actual prosecution of the violent crimes.
So there's some really strange aspects to this, like the sheriff who kept his testicles in a desk. How does this enter into all of this?
Well, so after Ashley identified, she just saw him driving around one day, and recognized his face and his vehicle, his red pickup truck. And she was with a friend. They jotted down the license plate number, immediately went to the cops, and they were able to easily trace that to Wayne Dumond. So he was arrested, but then he was let out on bail. While he was out on bail, two men broke into his house, hogtied him, and castrated him. And he almost died. But unfortunately for his two sons, they came home from school and found him and, called the ambulance, and, obviously he lived. Well, when the sheriff of the county, this was St. Francis County that this happened in, the sheriff Coolidge Conley, when he arrived on the scene, he saw Wayne's testicles laying in blood on the floor, walked over to them, grabbed a matchbox and scooped them up into the matchbox and left. They never made it into any kind of evidence locker or anything. And in fact, he kept them in a jar of formaldehyde and would take them out and show them off to reporters or anybody else he could, talk into, hey, look, I got something cool to show you.
I'm cringing.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I'm cringing, and this guy has it as his trophy. I don't know where to go with that one. Let's go to the the political side of this, because and you mentioned this at the beginning. Kind of the forces that free Dumond, the political conspiracies, the misinformation, maybe you could call it disinformation, and of course the rise of religious extremism. And I think it's been hyper driven by the internet. I mean, that's one thing that we didn't mention is that this is pre-internet days, like, and they
Yeah.
were still able to spread this stuff. But this helped give rise to things like the QAnon movement and the January 6th insurrection. Can you kind of walk us through how we get from point A to point Z?
Right. And that's kind of the whole second half of my book, because normally with a crime like that, a fellow rapes a girl, she identifies him, regardless of all the other crazy things that happened. He went to trial, a jury of his peers convicted him, he was sentenced to life without parole. That should be the end of the story. But it was because all these evangelicals, fundamentalists, and anti Clinton people were just absolutely convinced, or at least were trying to convince others, that Wayne Dumond was innocent, that they were able to get Mike Huckabee to illegally pressure the parole board to let him out on parole. And once he was let out on parole, as I said, he raped and murdered 2 women. Now, the conspiracy theories that were being spread around about Clinton, at first they were kind of just confined to, the evangelicals, the fundamentalists, and the people around the state who hated Clinton for, whatever reason. But as I was saying, in 1993, after Vince Foster's suicide, um, that's when some right-wing operatives got together and were like, hey, we need to, attach this to the Clintons somehow. And the Arkansas Project was born. That was designed to take any conspiracy theory, any allegation about the Clintons, and put them into sort of the right-wing pipeline of BS. So it first gets spread on like AM talk radio, or in, these hand copied, Clinton Watch newsletters and places like this. And then it gets picked up by more quote unquote legitimate news outlets like the LA Times, the American Spectator. And then that gets them elevated to legitimacy that is now being covered by the more mainstream press. And so it just kept going and going and going. And you had the Whitewater investigation, which was the longest lasting, most expensive investigation in the history of the country. And, despite the fact that the Clintons were never found guilty of any crimes, it just became, because it was repeated so much and so often, it just sort of became the truth, oh, they just must be crooked. And because nothing was ever really like put to bed. It wasn't firmly debunked and disavowed. It continued and it grew and metastasized. And that's when you start seeing it get spread around on social media and on the bigger podcast platforms like Alex Jones. And this is as I said, like the center of the QAnon conspiracy universe, so to speak. So I hope that kind of explains it. Like, you have to read the book. I definitely go, step by step to sort of show how these things are connected, but that's sort of the nutshell version.
And in the big picture, I think, so you mentioned Richard Mellon Scaife, and he's an interesting figure because, first of all, he gets his money from the Mellon fortune. And second of all, if you've ever read like the book Dark Money by Jane Meyer, you see how all this money starts feeding into all this disinformation that is driving all these conspiracies. And it's strangely enough its own conspiracy, but it's actually, unlike the other conspiracies, it's well documented and you can follow the money around.
Yeah.
And so without this money, that's able to really fund this guy, and Richard Mellon Scaife was kind of the Koch brothers before the Koch brothers became notorious.
Right.
And so he was feeding all of this stuff and was able to fund it because he had billions of dollars, and apparently nothing good to do with it. And so in these pre-Fox News, pre-internet days, this was what was driving all this stuff.
Right. And you also have to bear in mind, too, that when Bill Clinton ran for president in 92, um, the media landscape was undergoing a huge sea change. Um, you started seeing the rise of what we called tabloid TV, things like A Current Affair, which, you know, I can't remember which one was which, but one of them was hosted by Bill O'Reilly. Another one was owned by Rupert Murdoch. Like they were sort of not explicitly right wing, but they were owned and or hosted by people who were very much right wing. And whereas in earlier times, an elected figure's sort of picadillos, as long as they weren't illegal or anything like that, were kind of considered off limits to the press, more or less. Like you think about, JFK. He's rumored to have had all kinds of affairs, even in the White House and blah, blah, blah. But the press didn't report on that. But when Bill Clinton stepped onto the national stage, that had all changed. We had the 24-hour news cycle that got kicked off by CNN. You had tabloid TV, which, the more lurid, the better. And the Wayne Dumond story, I mean, oh my God, it's got a sex crime, it's got castration, it's got somehow a Clinton connection. It was like made for tabloid TV. So, it was a whole different scene that he had to contend with.
So, given that this is a criminal justice program normally, how do you see this kind of relating to criminal justice issues that we're kind of following today?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to the idea of justice being blind, that it shouldn't matter which side of the political aisle the perpetrator or the victim is. That, if you committed the crime and, the prosecution can present the evidence and a jury finds that beyond a reasonable doubt this person did the crime, then that should be it. But it was very much politicized. The only reason that people believed that Wayne Dumond was innocent was because they hated Bill Clinton so much. They were willing to believe literally anything about him. And so that, I think, is where the criminal justice side of it comes in.
Yeah, and if anything, those feelings have only exacerbated in the last 30 years.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And
The
now we have a
amount of, sorry,
oh, I was just going to say, now we have a president who is specifically appointing political sycophants to head the DOJ. So that could be really dangerous.
I don't want to lose this point, and I know you've raised it, but you really didn't discuss it. The other downside of all of this is that this guy gets freed and then he commits another murder, or he commits a murder.
He commits two murders.
Oh, two. So kind of walk us through that part of it.
Okay, so when he was granted parole, he wasn't able to just leave right away, because one of the conditions was that he had to leave the state of Arkansas, and no other state wanted him. But he was able to convince this church-going woman. Dusty had passed away by this time. She died in a car accident. His new wife, Terry, had been with a church group that had been going down to visit him in prison. She was in a suburb of Kansas City. He convinces her to marry him. So now that he has a documented connection to the state of Missouri, Missouri says, okay, we'll go ahead and let you transfer your parole here. So he moves up to the Kansas City area, and 6 weeks after he marries Terry, he raped and murdered a woman named Carol Sue Shields. And he wasn't caught right away because, he had no connection to the victim. And he had kind of hastily cleaned up the crime scene. You know, he took a lot of evidence with him. He didn't leave any fingerprints behind, that sort of thing. But she had fought, like there was evidence of, you know, quite a struggle. And so she had his skin under her fingernails. Well, they tested that against the most likely suspects, you know, the people closest to her, and, you know, they were excluded. So then it had to go into CODIS. And as you probably know, that takes a while. So in the meantime, he then rapes and murders another woman named Sarah Andrusek. Literally the day after he murdered Sarah Andrusek, the results from the crime lab came back matching Wayne Dumond's DNA to the DNA found on Carol Sue Shields. So he's arrested for Carol Sue Shields. He's charged. He's convicted. He's sentenced to life in prison without parole. Now, the Sarah Andrusek murder, the reason why she tends to get lost is that the prosecutor in that case, I feel like he was, rightfully, he didn't feel like there was a rush. Wayne Dumond was behind bars. He was never getting out. He had to focus on the criminals who were the most threat to public safety. So it took a while for him to sort of build the case, and he was going to bring it to a grand jury in order to charge him for the rape and murder of Sarah Andrusek when Wayne died in prison. So because he was never charged, let alone convicted for her murder, she tends to not get discussed. And I just really want to make sure that she's not forgotten.
Crazy story.
Yeah.
I mean, you could not write this as a novel any more lurid than it reads in real life.
Yeah. If I tried to say this was a work of fiction, no publisher would pick it up. They say it was just too crazy.
So pretty incredible. So we're almost out of time, but let's ask you one more question. If policymakers, journalists, or law enforcement officials were to read your book, what key lessons do you want them to take out of it?
The main lesson that I would want them to take out of it is to leave politics outside the door. Just follow the facts and the evidence wherever they lead without fear or favor.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, thank you, Delani, for coming on. Let me ask you this. Tell people the name of your book. Do you have it? Can you hold it up?
I don't have a physical copy yet.
Oh, wow. So when does it come out?
It's already out. You can get it wherever you buy books. An audio book will be coming out, but for now you do have ebooks and paperbacks and hardcover anywhere you buy books. They can, if they want to go directly to the press, it's put out by Wild Blue Press. And they can find me on social media at Dr. Bartlette with an E on the end. I'm on Facebook and on Blue Sky.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Delani.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.